Hey everybody, I'm David Robles. I'm coming up from the UCSC Farm and Garden, where we nourish and sustain people while we are engaging in this sustainable movement. And we work to keep this movement focused and relevant to all cultures across all walks of life. So I'm here because I speak for the trees, because I'm a tree translator. That just means that I'm a tree trainer, which means that I'm a bud manipulator, which makes me the best friend of a pollinator who then becomes a fruit generator, and next thing I know, I'm a seed saver telling that seed, see you later. See, I'm the type to strain his back, making the plant strain greater, but if it stays true to type, then we'll have a great flavor. Me and my people can then proceed to pick the pepper, then sell the pepper for some paper, or we could pluck a pear and pack it in the refrigerator. Either way, with a little bit of love and labor, I've managed to feed my neighbor on the same acre where I nurture nature. And I think this makes me a major change maker, somebody who's so empowered that he's likely to become mayor. But if you pulled up that onion and peeled back a layer, you see that I'm more of a team player, a creativity creator, a motivator for bed shapers, bed rakers, bread bakers, innovators, game shakers, irrigating propagators, and chain breakers, taking these shackles off of my hands. So, whether you're growing in the garden where the oxalis expands, whether you're growing in the fields with the loamy sands, whether you're growing in the Chadwick where every single bed slants, we got the world in our hands. It's right here in our hands. So if they ask you whether organic can feed the planet, tell them, well, it depends on their stance. If every bouquet that you make is just a painting with plants, and the canopy's a strategy to sculpt our lands, then our hard work is a hallmark that we prepped in advance. Because every single seed we sow, well, it's a brand new chance. And it's a brand new day. But it ain't a brand new way. I'm looking at all of you like, who should I thank? Because the foundation you laid means that the movement we make will mean nothing but opportunities for us to take. And that's love in advance. It's like CSA. That love is what we need. It's like NPK. And that love didn't depend on my DNA. So if they ask you what I would do, this is what I might say. As the fog lifts and the sun shines through, just remember who you are. You'll know what to do. As the fog lifts and the sun shines through, remember who you are. You'll know what to do. Thank you.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Szasz. I'm a professor of environmental studies here at UC Santa Cruz. So I'm here to welcome, well, first of all, welcome to the students from Environmental Studies 100 who are joining us. Thank you for being here. And I'm here to introduce Maude Barlow, and I downloaded some information about Maude, and there's so much that I can't possibly read all of it, but I'm going to read some just to give you a sense of what an amazing human being and what an amazing activist she is. So Maude Barlow started her career in the women's movement in Canada, serving as Director of Equal Opportunity for the City of Ottawa and leading a national coalition against violence against women. She later became Pierre Trudeau's advisor on women's issues when he was Prime Minister from 1983 to 1984. In 1985, she founded the Council of Canadians, Canada's largest citizen advocacy organization, which works to safeguard Canada's social security system and its water and energy heritage. And she has served as its chairperson since 1988. The Council of Canadians is also a leading voice in the international search for a more just and sustainable trade system, and through its Blue Planet project for universal rights to water, which is an issue that we're going to hopefully focus on in this talk. Barlow is the author or co-author of 16 books on all aspects of globalization and the theft of global commons, the latest being Blue Covenant, the Global Water Crisis, and the Coming Battle for the Right to Water. She is also chair of the board of the Washington-based Food and Water Watch, is on the executive committee of the San Francisco-based International Forum on Globalization, is a counselor with the Hamburg-based World Futures Council, and I suppose she gets some sleep sometime during the week, hopefully enough. And she is the recipient of 11 honorary doctorates and many awards. So I should also say that the other speaker who was scheduled to come today had to cancel out at the last moment. So this session of the teach-in is going to be devoted only to Maude's talk. And we'll have her talk first, and then we'll have questions and answers and a discussion after that. So let's welcome Maude Barlow.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you to all of you for being here. Provo, Ben, and that David, is he still here? The poet is fabulous. So thank you all. I'm just delighted to be here. I'm a Canadian. I live in Ottawa, and it took me a long time to get here. We don't have any direct flights from Ottawa to San Francisco, so you have to, bump around to Toronto or wherever, but I'm just very, very pleased to be here. We have had a few wonderful days just speaking with each other. These are people who've come from all over these are the North American laureates, but we represent people all over the world who basically want to give our lives to activism. And I guess I'm going to talk to you about water, but I guess what I'd like to start off by saying is that a life of an activist, somebody who devotes themselves to an issue that you care about, is a wonderful thing, and it can get you up in the morning in a way that nothing else can. And when you go through bad things in your life, if you've got something bigger, if you're part of a bigger family, it's a really important thing. So I just want to start off by urging you all to follow a dream and make sure you know where you want to go. I'm going to talk to you about the water issue. I didn't come out of the environmental movement. I came out of the women's movement, as Andrew said, and the human rights movement. And I was reading a trade agreement called the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement way back in 1984. Now, this is when Ronald Reagan was president, and we had a right-wing president or prime minister in our country named Brian Mulroney, and they were cooking up this free trade agreement, which they did sign and eventually morphed into NAFTA. And you know the North American Free Trade Agreement right now. Today is the day. You may or may not know this. We're following it really closely. Today is the day when they decide whether they're going to get an agreement in principle or not. And if they don't get an agreement in principle today, it's too late for this congressional session, which means that there's going to be a Mexican election before the agreement can then continue to be negotiated. And it's likely that there's going to be a more left-wing, more progressive government coming in Mexico. Obrador is likely to be the president. He's not particularly pro-NAFTA. So it's a very interesting story. And if any of you want to talk more about NAFTA with me, I'm thrilled to do it, because it's just something we're literally today watching what the decision will be, whether they try to get an agreement in principle. Just a word on that before I talk about water. We're very concerned. I don't know if any of you follow these trade agreements, but they contain, and then I'll go back to my story about reading this free trade agreement, but they contain something called an investor-state provision. An investor-state, in trade agreements in the past and in the World Trade Organization, if an industry in one country or a company in one country or an investor has a problem in another country, they had to get their government to lay a charge with the other government, right? But for the first time in a trade agreement, in NAFTA, they allowed corporations to bypass their own government and sue the government of another country directly. And it's very, very dangerous. It really it privatizes the whole dispute system, and it gives corporations the right to sue. Now, Canada has been sued many times by big American corporations, including big quarry operations, chemical manufacturers, oil companies. We've lost a whole bunch. we're currently facing $2.6 billion worth of challenges from American corporations, and they don't have to go through our courts. Basically, each challenge sets up a panel of 3 people. Usually they're trade lawyers that believe in all this stuff, and we basically lose our democratic rights piece by piece. So there's a huge fight around the world to get rid of this ISDS, Investor-State Dispute System, our settlement. We also have something like 3,600 bilateral trade agreements or investment agreements in the world that allow corporations to sue. And there'll be big corporations like the big giants from big countries, rich countries, suing smaller countries like Ecuador or Guatemala or, smaller, poorer countries in Africa and Asia. And when they win, they sometimes win settlements that could pay the whole health bill for, everything that they spend on health in a year, for instance. So it's a really dangerous new precedent that's really only about 15, 16 years old, but has really taken over. So we're trying to get rid of it. Now, here's the interesting thing. I disagree with Donald Trump on just about everything in the world. You might be surprised to think that I know that, to find that out, but he is against investor state. So we're in agreement on this small thing. Why is he against investor state for his own corporations? Because he doesn't want the auto companies and the other manufacturers operating in Mexico. He wants them to come home, and he doesn't want them to have that insurance of this investor state protection. He's also pushing for higher wages for Mexican workers. Do you think Donald Trump cares about Mexican workers? I don't think so. But he knows that those very low wages are an advantage to the car companies, all the big auto companies that have left. And they took something like 300,000 jobs in the United States and about 30,000 direct auto jobs from my country, Canada, plus all the spin-off jobs. So it's a real issue, these jobs moving offshore. But of course, it's not as if it's wonderful for the Mexican workers because they earn so little they can't afford the price of cars. So we've been pushing for higher wages for Mexican workers because we care about the Mexican workers. Donald Trump is pushing for higher wages for Mexican workers because he wants those companies to come back home. And if they have to pay Mexican workers what they pay American workers, they may as well come home. So I just thought you might be interested in this little interesting kind of flip on how things are going. Anyway, that's the NAFTA story. And if you want more information, and through the day, the decision will be made whether it's dead in the water, being postponed, do they come up with an agreement in principle? I don't think so. I don't think it's possible. And then what will Trump do? Will he just have a fit and pull out? So nobody knows. But these trade agreements are very important because a lot of the work that we're all doing on environment or human rights or standards on health and pesticides and chemicals and so on, they're all being negotiated by these trade agreements and trade bureaucrats who say, well, that's an impediment to trade, and your higher standards are interfering with our profits. So they tend to be used, these trade agreements tend to be used to push everything down to the lowest common denominator. And there's been a time in your country, in our country, when NAFTA was first debated, that it was a really passionate debate and everybody had an opinion. Now we've kind of lost interest, or a lot of people have lost interest in these trade agreements, and I would really urge you to learn more about them because they really are a level of governance over, they actually supersede nation-state laws, and it's really important that we understand that. So water. There are basically 2 major issues with water, and I just want to start off my talk about water with saying this, that we tend to think about water as being connected to climate change, or many people talk about climate change impacting water, and they wrap it all together. So if there's a problem with water, they say it's climate change. Now that's true to a great extent. The warming of our climate, the warming of our planet is of course impacting the temperature of water, of rivers and lakes, and the evaporation and so on takes place much more quickly. The ice is melting in the Arctic, as you know, so there are very real consequences involving water of climate change as we understand it. And when we normally talk about climate change, we mean greenhouse gas emission and fossil fuel. But I want to urge you today to think about water separately because many of the problems that we have with water have nothing to do with the climate change as we describe it as being, the burning of fossil fuels. We are polluting water around the world unbelievably. There are some countries where there are no clean water sources left, no, at least on the surface. We are damming our rivers to death. Most rivers do not, major rivers do not reach the ocean anymore. We are pulling up groundwater far faster than nature can replenish it. And there are parts of the world that are literally running out now. And it's extraordinarily important that we understand that our mismanagement, our abuse of water, this notion that water is a resource for us to use for our pleasure and our profit and to build an industrial society is killing the water of the planet. And this is something that we all learned as children, that you can't run out of water. The earth will never run out of water. We'll always have this water circulating. But that's actually not true. We're running out of available fresh water because we're polluting it or we're moving it from one place to another. And that often happens, by the way, with what's called virtual water. Virtual water is the water that's embedded in commodities, it's embedded in the way we make computers and clothes. So when you are exporting something around the world that has used water, has had water as its base, then you're exporting that water. And you know the story here in California with your almonds and, you know, so much of the produce that's grown here is exported out of the state and in many cases out of the country. And that's, again, very connected to these trade agreements that just say more stuff, more exports, more ships, more forests taken down, and so on. So this notion of growth is really dramatically impacting available fresh water. So let me just say to you a couple of dramatic statistics that the United Nations has put out. And one is that by 2030, the demand for water in our world will exceed supply by 40%. Now try to get your heads around that. That means that by 2030, and it's already so in many parts of the world, the available fresh water will not meet the needs. It will meet only 60% of the world's needs. And that's because the demand is growing up dramatically and the supply is going down. And the United Nations says that by 2050, as many 7 billion people in the world will be affected by the water crisis. So we're talking the vast majority of the world's population by that time will be negatively affected by this. 22 countries in Africa are in crisis. India is in crisis. Most of their major rivers are polluted beyond use. They should not be used for anything. Every single country in the Middle East is slated for the end water depletion within 20, 30, 40 years. In fact, with Yemen, Yemen is slated to be the first country in the world to actually run out of water. Australia has one major water source, the Murray-Darling River, and they had a terrible drought that ended a couple of years ago, but the river stopped, the Murray-Darling stopped running to the ocean, and literally there was a massive panic with the cities along there that just depended on this water. They're building desalination plants, and they're expensive, and they're polluting, and they don't work. But, you know, what do you do when you run out of water? But I think it's very important for us to realize that it's also in places in the world that have had a lot of water. China is a country that has been one of the water have countries. But in the last 15 years, half of the major rivers in China have totally disappeared. They're gone. Nobody knows where they went. Well, they think it's probably from hydroelectric fueled coal mining, but they're gone. And the remaining 50% of them are being sucked dry as China produces more and more of the goods for the world. Brazil is an incredibly important story, and it's an incredibly important story for countries like Canada, which has a lot of water. Brazil has a lot of water, and Brazil never had any history of drought, either written or even in oral history. But in the last 10 years, they've had massive drought in the south. And the reason is, again, not climate change. People say, oh, it's climate change. Not really, unless you change the definition of climate change. They've taken down so much of the rainforest that the massive amount of vapor and the currents that carry that vapor, called flying rivers, are no longer operating the way they did. So it used to be that the rainforest would give off massive amounts of this vapor. It would be carried down south, and every twice a year it would just, rain in Sao Paulo, and all the reservoirs would be filled. It's not happening anymore. They simply took down the biotic pump that produced this miracle every year. Brazil doesn't know what to do. The drought was so bad 2 years ago that they were talking about moving maybe something like 20 million people. They simply didn't know what to do. I was in a community in Sao Paulo, and the people had water coming out of their tap for only an hour in the morning from 5 to 6, and then late at night from 10 to 11. Sometimes it was just a trickle. Often it wasn't very clean. That's the water that they had. And these weren't people in the slums, which is another question altogether. These were people in a condominium. That's the reality that happens when you have water one day and you simply don't the next. And we need to understand the notion of exponential destruction. You can't count it. It's not 1 and 1 and 2 and 2 and 4 and 4. It's happening here, it's happening there, and suddenly what looked okay is not okay. And it's extraordinarily important for us to understand this. Water was not put here for us. The famous quote that I often quote is an advisor to President Hoover when they were building all those big dams in the 1930s, and he said, this scientist or this advisor said, when America will be great when it learns to conquer its rivers. And this is the notion of that humans, particularly in the West, have had, that nature is here for us to conquer. And we're at the top of the chain, and we can just take what we want. And that notion is obviously, it's harmful to forests, it's obviously harmful to the atmosphere and to the air with what we're doing with fossil fuel production. But it's really, really dangerous when it comes to water, because we are a planet running out of water. I don't want to scare you, but I do want to scare you, because I think that we need to face this and understand it's not just here in California. It's not a drought. This is a systematic destruction of the world's freshwater sources. So that's the ecological crisis. On the other side is the human rights crisis, which of course is connected. And so we start with a world of deep inequality. We start with a world in which there are people in poor countries. If you're wealthy, even if there's water scarcity, you're going to find the water somehow. But we know that already, even before this crisis peaks, as it's going to peak, 2 billion people in the world, 2 billion people in the world have to drink contaminated water every single day. They don't have any other choice. 2.5 billion people don't have sanitation, have absolutely no sanitation whatsoever. It's a very big issue for girls in the countries where this is most affected, because they won't go to school if there aren't washrooms, because they were not going to go out in the fields and so on. So and also they go with their mothers to find water. I was in Kibera. It's a slum in Kenya, in Nairobi. And they said, here's what we do. They defecate into plastic bags, and then they just throw the bags in the water. There's sort of a stream there. I mean, this is why the issues of the environment and human rights go hand in hand, because you can't ask people not to do that if they have no sanitation. But we're not going to be able to protect the environment unless we recognize the human rights to have the dignity of having a nice, clean, safe washroom like you have right here. Dirty water kills more children every single year in the world than all forms of violence put together, including war. And we see the double whammy now coming, where you've got the inequality already existing, meeting the sudden lack of water. And I think the best example is Cape Town, South Africa, which is an absolutely beautiful place. If any of you have seen it, you'll know how gorgeous it is. In the last 20 years, they've been warned by scientists, this crisis is coming, this crisis is coming. What did they do? They built golf courses and resorts and, multi-million-dollar mansions and, swimming pools and the whole lot, and just, something will come, somehow something will save it. And now they've crashed right into this incredible crisis. They've moved day zero when they're not going to have any water left. They keep moving it every month or so because they have so drastically cut their water use. But I talked to one person who said, I live in one of the townships, and the rationing that the rich folks are having now, we've lived with all our lives. We've never had water. So for us, this isn't particularly new. But the inequity and the inequality that already exists is dramatically impacted on poorer people. But I just want to say really strongly that we mustn't think this is far away. These are problems in other countries, poor countries. It's not so. There are problems in Europe around water. There are problems in North America. With this notion that somehow it's far away is not true. Yes, you've had a reprieve in California, but the long-term outlook for California is not good because you have engineered your water sources more than any other place on earth. The water is taken from where nature put it, and we should damn well leave it unless there's desperately needed ways to move water, and then we do it in a very different and careful way, but it's just been so cavalier here. And I'm not blaming. I just wrote a book called Boiling Point, Government Neglect, Corporate Abuse, and Canada's Water Crisis. We have a water crisis, and our government is totally neglectful, so I'm not being critical of California, I'm being critical of us all. Florida, you've been reading about the sinkholes where the earth opens up and drops down. That's called subsidence. That's when you take all the groundwater up and you leave the surface soil exposed. The Ogallala Aquifer was once the size of Lake Huron. It's been mercilessly farmed, and it's not family farms anymore. This is really massive corn production, a lot of it for biofuels. It takes 1,700 gallons of water to produce 1 gallon of corn ethanol, which is absolutely an incredible abuse of water. And I know we all eat off plates made from corn that we can then throw out and makes us feel better, but let me tell you, there's a huge water price for that practice, and we need to rethink it. But the Ogallala Aquifer is running out of water, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture says it will be gone in our lifetime. It will be gone, and it is the breadbasket, aside from California, for the United States and a massive exporter of food. There was a huge international study on groundwater taking, and they said that if the Great Lakes are being pumped as mercilessly as groundwater around the world, the Great Lakes could be, and I quote, bone dry in 80 years, which is really an astounding statistic. And I remember when I read that in a scientific journal, I thought this should be on the front page of every major newspaper in the country. I mean, why is this not on the front page of every newspaper in the country? I think we have this notion, this myth, what I call the myth of abundance, and this is what we learned back in grade 4 or whatever, 5, that this water will never run out, that it'll go around in the hydrologic cycle, and it is not only the same amount of water, but the same water that was in the blood of dinosaurs, right? So we learned that, and we need to unlearn it, and we need to unlearn it fast. So what are we doing, and how do we tackle these twin crises? Well, we need to tackle the crises, the ecological and the human rights crises, with principles. It's really, really important we get the values down solidly. And those values basically are that water has rights and needs to be protected and restored. So water protection, fierce water protection, and good management on one side, and water justice on the other. So we've got to think in those terms. We've got to share this resource in a different and better way. Water is not a resource for our profit and pleasure. It is not, and convenience. It is the essential element of all life, and if we don't take care of it, we're not going to have a planet. So we need good law, and we have a situation right now in your country where your government is undoing the laws that we have had to protect water. For instance, they're removing 97% of the funding for the rehabilitation of the Great Lakes. So just, as one example, there are many of them. So, but we have the right to good governance, and we have the right to continue to demand that our governments do the right thing. We cannot depend on companies doing the right thing. As Martin Luther King said, legislation may not change the heart, but it will restrain the heartless. We absolutely need the rule of law, and we need to protect groundwater. Do you know that in your country you legally are allowed to dump toxins, chemicals, industrial waste into specific sites into groundwater around the country? You need a permit to do it, but you can do it. And I think of that groundwater down there, and I think of an image that Mexico City's in trouble. Mexico's also sinking with this subsidence, and if you've been there recently, you'll see the big churches are all sort of on their side, like they're leaning over, right? That's because the ground is sinking. But they found a couple of years ago, they found a new groundwater source. It's not going to last forever, but it was nice, just under Mexico City. And when they pulled it up, this engineer who pulled the first cup of it took a sip of it, and he said, "This is why you protect groundwater." And I thought of the fact that so much of the groundwater here is being polluted with contaminants and chemicals that could could possibly stay forever in that water. So we need the rule of law. We need very strong, safe drinking water protection. Do you know that there is no protection? There are no laws around animal waste. We have fairly good laws around human waste, but animal waste from factory farms, as you know, is getting into our water sources all over North America. So we need new laws. We need new water laws and based on a new water ethic. And that water ethic should say that whatever we do, how we produce food, how we produce energy, how we trade across borders, all must answer the question, what's the impact on water? And if the impact is that it's harmful, we don't do it. You go back to the drawing board. There isn't any water, there isn't any extra out there. There's no new water coming anywhere. We need watershed restoration. This is incredibly important. We can bring back systems. I have seen miracles around the world where you would think that the desert, has become something that was an oasis, became a desert. It's now an oasis again. And this is part of the cycle that I'm talking about, which is when you remove either vegetation or water from a local hydrologic cycle, the hydrologic cycle dries up. Do you know that they know now what happened to the drought of the 1930s? That first, everybody knows that they took down the grasslands, massively took down the prairie grasslands way too fast. The soil dried up and blew away. Everybody knows that. They've known that since then. But what we're just discovering recently is people thought at the time when coincidentally there was this terrible drought. No, what they did to the grassland created the drought, because it negatively affected the hydrologic cycle, and the rain didn't come back. The rain won't come back where there's no vegetation or where you've removed the rivers and streams. So that's why we're creating deserts all over the world, but you can bring them back. And I've seen absolute miracles where a community in the desert at the mouth of the Murray-Darling, instead of going to the desalination route, they built wetlands. And they have greened the desert. They have so much water, they're able to, well, they sell it there, which I don't agree with, but anyway, they're selling it to the Twin City that did the desalination that didn't work. But you can restore nature. There's a deep, as the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins said, there's a deep dearness down in nature. If we just stop hurting it, it will come back. It will forgive us and come back. It's incredibly important. We also have to have a priority of raw water, on water out there in nature, because right now it's basically a free-for-all, and particularly in the west of your country and my country, they had this notion of first in time, first in right. So if you got 100 years ago, you got a license for a certain amount of water, you have that forever, whether the water is running out or not, and that's a bad law. That might have made sense 100 years ago, but it makes absolutely no sense at all. So we have to have laws, and I helped write the one in Vermont, and they have a groundwater law now that basically says in times of any kind of crisis or shortage, there are 3 priorities: water for basic human needs, water for the ecosystem, and water for local food production, but not food production for export, so not for agribusiness, and certainly not for bottled water. And I know you've got a champion on the bottled water front sitting beside me up here, and you've taken strong steps on this campus, and congratulations. Just to give you a number here, the insanity of the bottled water industry, last year they produced 465 billion single-use plastic bottles of water in the world. Now, you've read about the gyres and the plastic in the ocean, and they're in all our lakes and rivers. They're even plastic broken down in our water source and even in bottled water now. We are plasticizing our world, right? And it's not going to be an easy issue to do away with, but the first thing that we can do is to stop drinking bottled water when there's clean, safe water coming out of our taps. So it's incredibly important. So that's the ecological side, and it's urgent, urgent, urgent. On the water justice side, we need to understand and recognize and deeply believe and then act upon the notion that water is both a human right and a public trust. And the public trust is very important. What the public trust doctrine says is that certain elements, air and water and so on, are essential to life and must be shared for all. They must be governed for the greater good of all, not for the private profit of a few. So the struggle that a number of us have been very involved in, and Tony and I wrote the first book on this, Tony Clark, who's here, we wrote a book called Blue Gold and the Fight to Stop the Corporate Theft of the World's Water, because there is a huge move now to steal the world's water, to control it by corporations, either by big utilities and municipalities getting control of the water services for profit, or water markets, or in the case of Chile, big mining companies, often from my country, come in and they actually outbid the local communities, the local farmers, and so on. So it's incredibly important that we understand that it's a human right. And in 2010, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the human right to water and sanitation. I was there in the balcony that day, and my heart was pounding because I thought we were going to lose. Your country was opposed, my country was opposed, all sorts of powerful first world countries were opposed because they knew they would be responsible for delivering clean water to all their people. But only 42 abstained, 122 countries voted in favor, and it was an historic moment, and I think as a human species, we took an evolutionary step forward that day. Since then, almost 46 countries have either amended their constitution to recognize the human right to water, or they've brought in separate water laws. We've had court cases like the case in Botswana where the Indigenous people of the Kalahari Desert had been kicked out of the Kalahari because they'd found diamonds there, and they also wanted to bring in ecotourism, and they kept coming back because they're a hunter-gatherer people, and they wanted to come back to their homeland. And so the government smashed their bore wells and said anybody bringing water to them would be arrested. So they just basically wanted I was going to say starve them out. I don't know what the word would be for water, that they would die of thirst, and some of them did. They went to court. They got the right to go back to the desert. They went back to court for the right to water and were denied by the middle court. After the United Nations General Assembly ruled that it is a human right, they went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court in Botswana said, yes, indeed, they absolutely have the human right to water, and ordered their bore water to be reinstated. So it's a very real thing that we have, that we can start to work with this concept of the human right to water. I just want to end because I don't want to talk too much because I want to talk with you rather than at you. In more than 235 municipalities, including some big ones like Paris and Berlin, and Munich is about to do this, and some cities in Greece are becoming what they call blue communities, and they've taken water back from privatization into public hands, and it's very important. It's a very important grassroots movement around the world, because people are saying if water is a human right and water must be protected, we have to keep it in public hands. Governments have to be answerable to this. I'm just going to end by telling you a story. I was in Cochabamba, Bolivia in the late 1990s. And then I want to compare it to back here, because I really want us to understand these problems aren't just far away. I mean, I don't know if you've read about the situation in Detroit, where tens of thousands of people have had their water cut off because they can't pay for it. It's a largely African-American community. When NAFTA killed all the jobs in the auto jobs, they called it the white flight, the money and the executives all left for the suburbs. And what was left behind, the people that were left behind did not have the funds to fund the water system properly, so they started to increase the rates. They doubled and tripled the rates. People simply can't pay. So tens of thousands of people in inner city Detroit, and it's happening in other cities in the United States, Baltimore and Boston, literally don't have any water. You could be in a third world country, you could be in a community in another country where people are literally going to parks and turning on the public tap and so on to get water to bring home. No water for their families, no water for sick kids, no water for flushing toilets, none, no water. And sometimes they turn the water off for the whole block. This fight against privatization and water cutoffs is really global, and the World Bank has been telling poor countries, if you want water funding for water services, what I'm going to tell you is that you have to bring in a private company, and they're going to run it on a for-profit basis, and we'll do the contract and you have no say. So Bolivia was one of the first countries, and Bolivia is a landlocked country in South America, very poor, largely indigenous, about 85%. And they begged for help from the World Bank. So the World Bank brought in a company called Bechtel, which was a big engineering company, whose motto at the time was, "We pave the world." Lovely. So they knew nothing about water. So they set up this private water company, and the first thing they did was triple the price of water. Well, people could not afford the water. And then they said, and we own the rain coming from the sky. So we catch you capturing water in cisterns or pots or whatever, we're going to fine you. And they actually had inspectors going around into the communities and trying to catch people catching rain from the sky. So there was an uprising, and people took to the streets, and the army was called in. It was before the current president, Evo Morales, was there. And they shot people. People were killed. I mean, it was a real water war. And the people won. And they stood up to this company. Bechtel had to back down. The World Bank had to back down. And when Evo Morales came in, and it really was a result of this uprising, he kicked out all the private companies, all the private water companies in Bolivia. But I tell you this story because the leader of this fight was very brave, a small man in stature and slim and quiet. His name was Oscar Oliveira, and he was a shoemaker, and he'd never been outside of Cochabamba before, and he'd never done anything like this in his life, right? But he led the fight. Something inside him just came to the fore, and he just led this fight. He became this fearless leader we brought all over the world to tell his story, right? But I said to him, why water? Because you've been treated by foreign companies with your energy and everything else terribly for years and years and years. And he looked at me and he said, because I would rather die of a bullet than thirst. And I've never forgotten that. And I tell you that when I say to you it's not far away, do you know about the Alberta tar sands? And if you don't, you need to. This is a massive oil mining production in Canada. We have the second largest deposit of this heavy bitumen in the world, and that is oil that you have to extract from this sandy clay. So it's not conventional oil, but we're all running out of conventional oil, so we're going to this more dangerous, they call it extreme energy. It produces a great deal of greenhouse gas emissions, and it poisons the water everywhere. So, and that was what they were going to take down in the pipeline through Keystone, which Obama vetoed, and now Trump has said yes, it could go ahead, but I don't think it's going to go ahead. And we've had huge pipeline fights in Canada because this stuff is very heavy, and to move it through a pipeline, they have to make it liquefied with chemicals like benzene. That's the only way it can go through. And when there are spills, and there have been, it's totally, terribly dangerous for the environment and for the people who live there and for the water particularly. So I did my first site visit to the tar sands. It looks like a moonscape. Like there isn't a blade of grass, there isn't a tree, massive, massive area. It's just one huge mine of extractive mining operation for this stuff. Massive, huge, as high as the ceiling here, these great big tractor vehicles, just unbelievable. And I stood on the bank of this, it's called the Syncrude site, and the Syncrude is one of the big companies there, and they have a dam. It's the second biggest dam in the world, and it's filled with toxic water from the tailings. It's called a tailings pond. It's not a lake, but it looks like a lake, and it smells horrible, and you get headaches if you're standing there. I had headaches days later just from being there, right? And they have to have this sound of gunshot every couple of seconds, because as the birds fly over, they think it's a lake, but it's not, because if they land, they die. So they have to keep shooting it up because it's bad PR to have these dead birds photographed all the time, which happens quite regularly. We held a press conference back in Edmonton when we brought a whole bunch of us to go see it, and a young Indigenous leader, Mike Mercredi, talked about the cancers in his community. He's a Cree First Nation, and they live just downstream, and they're getting cancers in children unheard of in their community. He said, we can't drink the water. We can't hunt the animals because the animals drink the water. We can't plant our traditional plant food. They're bringing in bottled water. Talk about bottled water. That's the only water we can drink. And he said, our people are dying. And he was weeping as he said this. And we had a lot of media there. I called it Canada's Mordor, which I thought was the right image. But he said, and I tell you this because it reminds me of what Oscar said. Somebody said to him, "You sound so angry." And he said, "You know what? I'm so angry that what I want to say is it would be kinder of you to come and shoot us than to kill us this way." And I remembered what Oscar had said, and I thought, it's come home. And this is the part of globalization that we need to understand, is that you're not going to keep those issues far away. We are a human species, and we drink the same water, and we breathe the same air, and we need to care for it and one another. And we need some rules here, and we need to care deeply and separately about this precious thing called water. I think if we do it right, that water might end up being nature's gift to us to teach us how to live more lightly on Mother Earth and more in peace with one another. Thank you so much.
And let's have some questions from the audience. For Maude, comments? Yes.
Thank you for being here. I heard your story last night, how you mentioned that with the aquifer lake around Lake Huron, that the first people to respond were First Nations women. And I'm hearing your story about the community in Colombia, and I'm curious what you've learned from First Nations people in protecting their environment and
How's that? Yeah. Okay, so the question is, my friend, what's your name? Gamby noted that I had mentioned, I told a different story last night, I can tell that one today too, but a story about a win that we had up in my country that was led by First Nations women. And so what have I learned from Indigenous people around the world on this issue? We all have to learn what Indigenous people have not lost, or most Indigenous communities have not lost, and that is that water is sacred, and water is part of all of their ceremonies. It's part of, it's what gets you up in the morning. You would never hurt Mother Earth. You would never, hurting Mother Earth, hurting water would be like cutting your own self, like cutting your own, making yourself bleed. You don't do that. And so we work very closely in my country, and we work very closely with Indigenous communities around the world on the human right to water. What we're knowing is that the worst threats to water are extractive industry projects in Indigenous communities around the world. So it's mining companies, and Canadian mining companies are the worst. 75% of all the mines in the world belong to a mining company registered in Canada, because we have very loose standards. We're very embarrassed about it. We're trying very hard. We tried with the last government, one before the worst we ever had, which was just finished, to get a law that would say that Canadian mining companies operating internationally have to obey the same standards they would have to obey in Canada. But they go at places and they use their, their blasting methods and their chemical-based methods, and then they pay for the sports team for the local high school, and they think that sort of makes it all up. So we work a lot with communities around that, and in my country, the pipelines the pipelines they want to build and the pipelines they have built go right through Indigenous communities. So we're very supportive of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it's important to know that it was a very important next step in the concept of human rights. There are basically three kinds of human rights, or three generations. The first is the right from persecution, so the right not to be tortured, the right to be allowed to set up a union, collective bargaining or whatever, the right to free speech. So the right to, just those fundamental rights, they don't necessarily cost governments anything, but that was fundamental to the UN Declaration on Human Rights in 1948. The second generation are more, governments don't like them as much because then they're responsible, but that's the right to employment, the right to housing, the right to education, the right to healthcare, that kind of thing. But the Indigenous rights, the one in this United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, goes further. it actually recognizes community. It recognizes culture. It recognizes the relationship of the people with the land and the water. And so when and we've actually had cases going to the Supreme Court in Canada where people are saying that extractive industry has violated my beliefs, my values. And the courts don't know what to do with this because we haven't gone that far in the courts in Canada, although our government has recognized the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But they're still building pipelines, so they want it both ways, right? But and they don't have, I mean, there's no army in the United Nations that's going to come in and make you do this, right? It's a moral authority that you take, but we are pushing the envelope to understand this notion of rights, and it's profoundly connected to the earth and the water. It's inseparable for Indigenous communities, and so and the language, I don't know if you've read that declaration, but it's worth looking at the language because it's absolutely gorgeous, and it recognizes that the notion of nature and us is just inseparable. And we've lost that in Western society. Most of our laws, water and nature, are property. For instance, in the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico, the only way you could get compensation is if you could show your property or your business was negatively impacted, right? But could you get funding for the fish? What if the fish could sue? I mean, this whole notion of the fact that the nature has rights beyond us, and that's, we have to go even beyond the human right to water. We have to go to the right of water itself. To exist, to look after other species, to look after the ecosystem. It doesn't just serve us, even if we do it better and more justly. It's still not just ours. And these are the boundaries that we're now trying to reach, I think, and it's Indigenous peoples who are leading the way, certainly in my country, and I think here as well.
Anyone else, please? Yes.
Justin Trudeau, so that's our current Prime Minister, if you don't know. He's very handsome. You will have seen him. When he went to Singapore, the government actually put out a media statement saying that the women were not to swoon and I'm not making this up. There no swooning or touching him. That was it. There was no swooning or touching. I mean that. I'm not making that up. He's on the front page of GQ, and and he's deeply, deeply committed, he says, and I don't disbelieve him. He's deeply committed to Indigenous peoples, and he's put actually quite a lot of money into the water. We have a huge crisis of water in First Nations communities in Canada. And we were in Paris. I was in Paris with the Climate Summit in 2 years ago when he was first Prime Minister, and we let Canada finally, not only could we put our heads up and not be totally ashamed because we had this horrible, awful right-wing government for 12 years, not only could we put our head up, but our government led the charge that they would aim for a 1.5 degree, bar for the summit at the end. We were getting the Dog of the Year award, or what was it called, the Oyster of the Year award or whatever, and now suddenly we were shining. We were all kind of, oh yes, I'm Canadian again, I can be proud. He wants that, but he's going to build his pipelines, you see. So how do you square that? Well, the way he squares it is he's not going to build a lot of pipelines. He'd like to build Keystone because that's more your problem than ours. But so we fought a big fight around the proposed Eastern pipeline that would have gone, well, I don't know if you know Canada, so there's great big British Columbia and then Alberta, which is where the tar sands are, and then it goes east. Well, from a little town called Hardisty in Alberta, this pipeline was going to be bigger than Keystone, or bigger than Keystone is planned to be, was going to go all across Canada, under the St. Lawrence River, across 3,100 water sources, down to New Brunswick and be taken down in ships and barges to Texas, to your refineries in Texas, where they can poison the water in Texas, along that coast, along that rocky coast. It's just insane, right? So we fought it every inch of the way, and we won. So now he's promoting a pipeline going west, and I think there will be people who put their lives down. They'll lie down in front of the machines before, and Indigenous people will do that before it's allowed to be built. And it's an American company, a great big company called Kinder Morgan. And our government has said to this big multi-billion-dollar foreign company, foreign to us, will underwrite any losses that the political situation gives you. It just makes me crazy. It's just like, we need that for water cleanup and so on. So how to explain that? Our last prime minister didn't care at all, undid all the water laws that we had. We're fighting to get them back, and I think we'll get them back. He was just terrible. This government is like, I would say Obama, think Bush, Obama. That's what we have. Did Obama undo all the environmental damage that Bush did? No, he didn't. And that's the problem when you get good law, good environmental law or good health law or whatever, and then it gets undone. It's very hard to get it back. You find that you maybe elect an administration that would not have done that in the first place, but are they going to undo it is the question. And Robert Kennedy Jr. wrote a book about that, saying basically, what did Clinton do to undo all the damage first Bush did? Nothing. And first Bush took away apparently 400 some regulations, important environmental regulations. And I said to Robert Kennedy Jr., and how many did Clinton bring back? And he said none. So we just, in times of any kind of crisis, it's the environment that goes first, and that's Trump. He wants to bring those companies home. He's slashed corporate taxes, slashed taxes to the rich, and he's just it's a free-for-all in terms of regulation. So yeah, come here and make a buck, and we will look the other way no matter what happens. And I really feel that the issue of clean water in people's backyards, and I mean backyards, I mean their community lakes, your drinking water source, is a very, very powerful way to enter this debate. If you haven't thought of politics in the past, and you don't maybe understand global warming, or it feels too far away, the fact that your water could get contaminated. And there's a wonderful person in the room, Robert Bilott, back here, who's a lawyer who took on a company called DuPont with a huge fight against chemical contamination, who can tell you how and you should hear him this afternoon, how really terrible the fight is here and in my country as well, to get a recognition and understanding of chemical contamination. But I find when people understand it in their drinking water, for their kids and their grandkids, something really profound can change. So that's a complicated answer to your question. He's a good person, trying to do everything, trying to save the environment and produce energy, extractive industries, and won't take on the mining companies. So the proof is in the pudding in the end, right? We do get disappointed in governments, don't we? Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about fracking, and specifically in the Oklahoma area, but I would have you heard anything about any progressive groups doing something to block continuous fracking?
Fracking is a terrible, terrible thing. Hydrologic fracking is different from fracking that was done, 15 years ago, a different kind. This is where, they steam blast using water and a mix of 600 chemicals, at least a quarter of which are carcinogenic, into shale formations. And it releases the gas, and it uses a tremendous amount of water, and it leaves behind a tremendous amount of wastewater, poisoned, contaminated water. As you know, I'm sure you know this. Yes, the group there are groups, but the one I would send you to is Food and Water Watch. I'm on the board. And Food and Water Watch has led the fight to get New York State to ban fracking, and is very involved they've got offices we've got offices all across and a tremendous amount of information on the fracking fights and what's happening. It's worse again under Trump because Trump's not listening at all. It's just, again, it's, they're going to allow drilling in the off Alaska and drilling in the national parks and so on. So the fracking fight will be just one. We did have a win. The Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard, actually said that they were prepared to start allowing fracked wastewater to be moved on barges on American lakes and rivers. And there was such an outcry, including from Food and Water Watch, but other groups as well, that they've backtracked, and that's really good because not only would you be using too much water and producing all this poison water, now you would be carrying the wastewater on barges on the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi. And I mean, are we crazy? What, are we crazy? Do we think there's somewhere else to go to get this water, or just somehow it's just going to materialize somewhere? So we do have wins, and I think it's really important for you to know that we are collectively around the world asserting our rights and protecting water sources and coming up with incredible projects. I mean, I have seen the most hopeful projects around the world, but I do feel strongly that we need to be separately conscious about water and not just think somehow it's, I'll put it a different way. If we stopped every bit of greenhouse gas emission, every burning of fossil fuel tomorrow, we'd still have a water crisis. And that was where we would turn our attention, but I'm asking us to turn our attention to it now. Yes?
Yeah, thanks for coming to Santa Cruz. Maybe you can clarify something for me about the tar sands production. I understand that almost as much energy is used in the process of getting the energy, so the trade-off is very low, say compared to the early days of oil mining when black stuff was on the surface and it was a very small amount of energy used to get a great amount of energy. Is that true?
Yeah, the question, the correct statement is that it takes almost as much energy to produce tar sands energy as it takes as much to produce it as is produced, and that's.
And is that fossil fuel energy that's
Yes, it's natural gas. But the issue is that we're running out, and then we're fracking that gas. In Western Canada, a lot of the gas that's used to produce the tar sands is natural gas from fracking. And the biggest fracking operation in the world is up in a little town called Hope in the northeastern area of British Columbia, and it's all Indigenous. It's a whole Indigenous community, and they're just on their knees. They've just got massive fracking operations. They've got earthquakes. They've got people getting sick from it because it's just Indigenous people. It's almost unpopulated is the way it's described. So it's not in a big urban setting, and it's not making thousands sick. It's making maybe hundreds sick, and so that's how they get away with it. But yes, it takes almost as much energy to produce it as it produces. But the issue is that we're running out of conventional oil in my country, and so they're moving to whatever's left. And so as we move away from conventional, we move to what's called toxic energy, or extreme energy is the other term that's used. That's when you've run out of the, I'm not saying that conventional energy or conventional oil is fine, or a conventional oil spill is fine, but we know how to deal a bit with a conventional oil spill, whereas we know that this bitumen is a totally different animal. There was a spill in Kalamazoo, Michigan of Canadian bitumen with these chemicals in it. And it was 7 years ago, and they still can't clean it up. People moved away, businesses closed, the fishery was closed, the stuff just went to the bottom of the river, and they cannot scrape it up. It doesn't break down. And the chemicals all evaporated and made everybody sick. So this is a different animal. It's the dirtiest energy on earth. And there's a ton of it in the United States, with or without Keystone. People don't know that they doubled what's called Line 67, which goes from that same Hardisty, Alberta, down to Superior, Wisconsin. It's put on barges. It goes around the Great Lakes on barges. It's taken by rail and pipeline down to Texas for refining. And we're trying really, really hard to curb the growth of the tar sands and move to renewables. The problem is, and we all know this, that there are many, many thousands of people depending on for jobs in these extractive industries. It's the same issue as with the military. You want to, it's insane, that we're spending this amount of money on what? But it's its own animal. And so we have grassroots fights with people who say keep the jobs and, they say let the eastern bastards, that means people who live in the east of Canada, let them drown in the dark or whatever. There's a lot of anger around, you want to come and take our jobs. No, we'd like you to transition to clean energy, but it's a big fight.
What's your take on personal and institution decentralized water systems, like rainwater catchment tanks for irrigation and bioswales? Like, do those make any impact?
Sure.
Or are they just hopeless?
No, not at all hopeless. A very, very good question about alternative energy, decentralized water systems where communities capture water, where, rebuilding water, the water gardens, they're hugely important. I just don't want us to give up on governments. Let me just say that, okay? Bill McGibbon, somebody asked him the other night, the 350.org, he said, what can I do as an individual about climate change? And he gave a few things, but he said, don't be so individual. Join a movement and make change. And so I don't want us to say, well, governments will never do it, therefore we'll fix it all in our own communities. At the same time, there's wonderful stuff happening in many, many communities where people are bringing in porous pavement, where they're, if we could capture water, all the water that from our homes, for instance, and it would not go onto pavement, and then through pavement go into pipes, a lot of which goes out to the oceans. There's a wonderful man named Michael Kravcik, Kravcik. If you want to learn more about how the planet is losing fresh water to the oceans, not just from the melting of the ice, but because of massive paving over of our cities and farmland and so on. So all that land, that soil that would have taken the water and then used that water for all the good things that water is used for, it massively goes on hard surfaces and then is taken by sewers very often to water sources that lead it to the ocean. And he actually he's from Czechoslovakia, and he actually did a study in his own country, and he was able to show how much water is being lost with each increase in paving over. So the water retention, the notion of finding ways to rebuild is incredibly important. I told you a little bit about that place in Australia, but it's pure magic. You stand there and I think they've got something like 300 huge wetlands in a desert. This is a desert. And they've brought back trees. There are hundreds of species of birds that never existed there before. They found the water. They've created an oasis. And this is a city. This isn't a small community. They have so much water that they separate anything that's toxic in it, and they actually store it in groundwater. And they're actually able to use water that they've captured from human use and so on, and gray water and rainwater, and then just the water that they've recovered. We can do it, and sometimes it does take that small step. And of course, we haven't even talked here about soil and the total importance of not using chemicals and of healthy soils, because healthy soils, of course, and Wes Jackson, who's speaking on the prairies somewhere else right here, he'd tell you this, we need healthy soils to be able to receive that rain, and that was one of the great lessons of the Dust Bowl. Not only did taking down the grass, not only did that mean the rain couldn't come down, the rain stopped trying, and that created that drought. So it's little miracles matter, but so does the right law, and we have to continue to do both, I think. How's our time? Any other burning questions? Yeah.
You said that desalination plants were ineffective.
Okay, the question is on desalination. It's not so much that they're ineffective, and sometimes they're going to be the only option available. But desalination is very expensive, number one. And so you don't find desalination plants in Africa or in, poor countries around the world. You find it in wealthy countries of the Middle East, for instance, or the United States. It's energy intensive, so it produces problems for water and climate that it's supposed to be offsetting. And it creates a poisonous brine because what it does is has this huge intake system that brings in the water, the seawater, and then they use the ozone and chemicals to separate the salt from the water and the animals that come in, the fish and so on, or the plants that come in. And then what they do is they send this brine, this salt, poison brine laden with chemicals back into the ocean. And for instance, in the Gulf off the coast of Saudi Arabia, they're talking about peak salt. Whoever heard of peak salt? They've sent so much, they've desalinated so much that they've taken the water out of the near area, and it doesn't get flushed out to sea because they dammed all their rivers. So, I mean, it's just, if you looked at it, you'd say, you just keep taking the same water, and you take the water out and you put the salt back into this, basically what it is, it's an estuary, and then you don't have any way to flush that out to the ocean. You don't have any left. And I quoted in one of my books a scientist who said that in Qatar, which is one of the, came up in the desert, this massive, gorgeous city with gleaming towers and hotels and, shopping malls and so on. They have 1 week's worth of water in storage. And if there was ever, for some reason, their desalination plant died or there was a war or a fight or whatever, there's no water. They have absolutely no access to water whatsoever. So I don't know what's in the human psyche that we think that we can play God like that, but I think we're going to find out, because I think this water crisis is going to hit in different ways than we could have understood. But I don't want to leave you with a negative notion. I do want you to be a little scared, but I do want you to also know that there's everything to be done about it. There are, from continuing the fight against bottled water to standing up for local, fights around privatization and keeping water in public hands, for understanding what's happening in places like Detroit and caring and doing what you can to do about it, and then caring about it internationally and fighting for good law. We need it. And I feel that water can be, as I said, this gift from nature to bind us together in a very powerful, common fight. Now, thank you very much. It's been wonderful to be with you this morning.